What is the SpaceX Moonbase going to be like? It's hard to deny that the moon is currently the hottest destination in the solar system. Nations around the world are racing back to it, while private companies see it as the foundation of a brand new trillion-dollar economy. Of course, Elon Musk has his own vision for the moon as well. And just like many of his ambitious ideas, the SpaceX Moonbase could end up being something unlike anything we've ever seen before. Because apparently, colonizing only Mars wasn't ambitious enough in his book. So how does SpaceX plan to build its own moon base? And could it end up being even more capable than the lunar bases other nations are currently planning? A permanent moon base has basically been on humanity's space to-do list ever since the Apollo astronauts first bounced around the lunar surface. The idea sounds simple enough. Go to the moon, build a base, stay there. In reality, it's a bit like building a cabin in the middle of Antarctica, except everything has to be launched from Earth on giant rockets that occasionally explode. But SpaceX has a very unique and interesting approach. Instead of landing a spacecraft, unloading it, and then leaving it sitting around like an abandoned moving truck, why not turn the spacecraft itself into the base? That's where SpaceX's Starship human landing system comes in. Just look at the thing. The vehicle already has an enormous internal volume, and according to this concept, even the fuel tanks could eventually be converted into living and working spaces. Rather than throwing away valuable hardware, the entire vehicle would become part of the settlement. It's the ultimate version of reusability. Most companies are happy if you reuse a shopping bag. This plan wants to reuse an entire moon rocket. Starship's massive size means that once converted, the resulting habitat could provide roughly 2.5 times the living volume of the International Space Station. That's a lot of room by space standards, where astronauts are usually thrilled to have enough personal space to avoid accidentally floating into their coworkers during breakfast. Of course, turning a giant rocket into a moon base isn't as simple as parking it and calling it a day, so here is how the plan is going to be. The mission begins with 2 starships heading to the moon. One carries the crew, while the other acts as a giant cargo truck loaded with tools, equipment, supplies, and everything needed to build the settlement. Both vehicles would first refuel in Earth orbit before making the journey to the lunar surface. The destination is the rim of Shackleton Crater near the moon's south pole, one of the hottest pieces of real estate in the solar system right now. It offers near-constant sunlight for power generation, potential access to water ice, and a permanent view of Earth hanging in the sky. Not a bad neighborhood by lunar standards. The 2 starships wouldn't land right next to each other, though. They'd touch down about 5 kilometers apart. That might seem excessive until you remember that landing a giant rocket on the moon tends to throw dust and rocks everywhere. Nobody wants their future home damaged because another spacecraft parked too close. Once on the surface, the real workforce gets deployed. And I'm not talking about the astronauts. Come on, it's the 21st century. Humans don't do that kind of work anymore. Instead, the crew will remotely operate a fleet of robots that will handle the transition of the lunar base. These robots would handle much of the dangerous outdoor work while astronauts supervise from inside. Think of them as the moon's first construction crew. They would unload solar panels, communication equipment, radiators, and power systems. They would also drain leftover propellant from the Starship into storage tanks before preparing the vehicle for its biggest transformation. And this is where things get interesting. The robots would literally tip the Starship over to help reposition it from its landing orientation into a more practical horizontal habitat. Because apparently landing on another world isn't enough work already. Okay, serious talk. Even though that sounds insane at first. I mean, you're trying to tip over a 50-meter-tall spacecraft worth billions of dollars without breaking it. Space engineers spend years making sure rockets stay upright, and here, the plan is intentionally knocking one down. But doing so creates a much more practical habitat layout, giving astronauts multiple floors running horizontally through the vehicle. The process would use hinges, anchor cables, and lifting systems to carefully control the descent. The cables would support much of the load early on, while specialized lifting equipment would take over as the vehicle gets closer to the ground. The goal is to lower Starship slowly and safely, rather than letting several hundred tons of spacecraft discover gravity the hard way. Once horizontal, the vehicle would settle between ridges of piled lunar soil that help support the structure and prevent it from rolling. From there, the robots would begin burying the habitat beneath layers of regolith to protect the habitat from radiation, micrometeorites, and the harsh lunar environment. Meanwhile, astronauts transform former fuel tanks into living quarters, workspaces, and the first permanent rooms of humanity's future lunar home. Of course, building a moon base isn't just an engineering challenge. You also have to keep the astronauts alive, healthy, productive, and ideally not completely miserable while doing it. That's where things get complicated. Living on the moon introduces a whole collection of problems that astronauts on the International Space Station don't have to deal with. There's lunar dust, higher radiation levels, reduced gravity, heavy physical workloads, and the general stress of trying to build a permanent settlement on another world. It's basically a construction project where every mistake happens 384,000 kilometers from the nearest hospital. One of the biggest considerations is the spacesuit itself. Future lunar astronauts won't just be floating around like crews aboard the ISS. They'll be walking, climbing, carrying equipment, operating machinery, and spending hours working on the surface. And surprisingly, heavier may actually be better. Research cited in the proposal suggests that lunar spacesuits could perform best at weights between 180 and 320 kilograms. That sounds completely ridiculous until you remember the moon only has 1/6 of Earth's gravity. A suit that would feel like carrying a small car on Earth suddenly becomes much more manageable on the lunar surface. Future suits would also need better mobility, improved visibility, biomedical sensors, smarter life support systems, and even heads-up displays. Basically, astronauts will need something closer to a sci-fi exoskeleton than the bulky suits we've become familiar with. Then there's the actual work itself. The researchers used NASA's workload assessment tools to estimate which tasks would be the most demanding during construction. Unsurprisingly, converting Starship's massive fuel tanks into living spaces ranked among the toughest jobs. Imagine renovating an apartment while wearing a spacesuit, operating power tools, managing life support systems, and trying not to float or bounce away from your workspace. But if there is one thing lunar veterans consistently worry about, it's dust. Lunar dust is nasty stuff. Unlike Earth's weathered sand, lunar dust particles are sharp, cling to everything through electrostatic forces, and can potentially cause respiratory problems if inhaled.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Apollo astronauts complained about it constantly, and they only stayed for a few days. This Moonbase crew would be dealing with it for months. The solution involves advanced dust removal systems, improved airlocks, stricter cleaning procedures, and carefully limiting astronaut exposure. Because nobody wants their billion-dollar moon base turning into the solar system's most expensive, dusty garage. Radiation is another serious concern. Measurements suggest astronauts on the moon could receive radiation doses several times higher than crews aboard the ISS. Most of the time, exposure accumulates slowly, but solar storms can create much more dangerous situations. That's one reason the base would eventually be buried under several meters of lunar soil. The regolith acts as a giant natural radiation shield. In an emergency, astronauts would have roughly 30 minutes to get back inside and seek shelter. Not exactly the kind of weather forecast you want to hear. Then there's gravity, or rather, the lack of it. Living in 1/6 Earth gravity for extended periods can weaken muscles, reduce bone density, affect balance, and even alter immune system function. So despite living on the moon, astronauts would still need a serious workout routine. The proposed base includes treadmills, rowing machines, resistance training equipment, and dedicated exercise areas to keep the crew healthy. In other words, even after building humanity's first lunar settlement, the astronauts still won't be able to skip leg day. You know what would be a lot easier than building a moon base? Hitting the subscribe button. So if you're enjoying the video, don't be shy. It would really make my day. Thanks. Now let's get back to the video. But perhaps the biggest challenge isn't technical at all. It's maintained funding, political support, and public interest for decades. Building a lunar base isn't a 2-year project. It's a generational commitment. Governments are usually willing to fund high-risk projects that may not generate immediate profits. Private companies, meanwhile, are much better at finding ways to reduce costs and turn ambitious ideas into sustainable businesses. Combine the two, and you potentially get a system that can actually support a permanent lunar settlement. Creating commercial opportunities inside the settlement could help attract partners, generate revenue, and eventually kickstart a broader lunar economy. According to SpaceX, a permanent lunar presence could eventually grow into an entirely new trillion-dollar economy. Instead of being just a destination for astronauts, the moon could become a major hub for transportation, communications, manufacturing, mining, energy production, and deep space exploration. While government agencies would likely be the first customers, private companies could eventually move in as well, turning the moon into a center for industry and logistics beyond Earth. A huge part of that vision involves manufacturing directly on the moon. If future settlements can mine water ice and process local resources into fuel and construction materials, they would become far less dependent on Earth. Since the moon's gravity is much weaker, launching cargo from its surface would also be far easier and cheaper. SpaceX believes future factories could build satellites and other infrastructure in space using mostly lunar materials, with only specialized components shipped from Earth. One of the most ambitious ideas is a lunar mass driver, a giant electromagnetic launch system built on the moon. Instead of using rockets, payloads could be accelerated down a track and launched into space using electricity. Thanks to the moon's low gravity and lack of atmosphere, this system could potentially move cargo far more cheaply than conventional rockets. Communication is another key piece of the plan. Building on Starlink technology, SpaceX is exploring a lunar communications network that could provide high-speed internet across the moon. Future satellites using laser links could transmit enormous amounts of data back to Earth, supporting astronauts' habitats, rovers, and scientific missions. In the long run, future lunar settlers might have access to gigabit-speed internet while living nearly 400,000 kilometers from home. And that's before anyone starts talking about tourism. Because, let's be honest, the first hotel room with a permanent view of Earth from the moon is probably going to sell out instantly. Okay, let's tackle the final problem of a lunar base. Even if you can build the base and pay for it, there's still one tricky question left. Can you legally do it? Technically, the moon belongs to no nation, but countries are free to explore and use it peacefully. In other words, you can build a house on the moon. You just can't claim ownership of the moon itself. Perhaps it could be a case similar to the International Space Station. The ISS has spent more than 2 decades proving that countries with very different interests can successfully build and operate something extraordinary together. Because if humanity is serious about becoming a multi-planet species, the first permanent moon base probably won't belong to one company or one nation. It will belong to one of the most complicated international group projects in human history. And if you've ever worked on a group project before, you already know that part might be the hardest challenge of all.